It's finally time to start talking about the Mimic. And to further flesh out our Lorkboard, or Lorkboard for those who aren't unaware, I thought it best to go over only the direct information about the Mimic from the books. We'll go over the games when we get to them. So what do the books tell us about the Mimic and the Mimic 1 program? A lot, actually, so slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves some literary analysis for the probably final time of this miniseries. As always, before we deep dive into a book, continuity needs to be mentioned. I did the whole spiel last video, but essentially, Scott has never directly confirmed whether or not the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are in the same continuity of the games. Many people assume they are because they are so similar, but personally, I prefer to take a more cautious route and just assume that they are separate continuities, but there's a lot of overlap. So, rules of the universe, information about characters that cross over, things like that, that's what we're looking for here. But ultimately, assuming all of the Tales from the Pizzaplex books are in continuity is completely valid. It's just something I'm not personally going to do. That being said, I'm going to add details of the Mimic to the Lorkboard that may or may not only be details from the book, but it's still worth writing down. Just like how in the Silver Eyes, I mention all the stuff about Charlie, even though that might not be true for the games. So, long story short, let's talk Mimic. We'll start with the story that's earliest in the timeline of this character, titled The Mimic. It follows Edwin Murray, a man living with his son David in an abandoned warehouse where he's contracted by Fazbear to turn costumes into animatronics. This is like a long time ago. While he's doing this, he finds his son David very annoying and disruptive, mainly because David's a kid and he's bad at liking his child. So instead of being a parent, Edwin builds the Mimic. He essentially takes some hodgepodge pieces from a few things to build the upper half of an endoskeleton, and I'll describe it here. He then creates a program that will take in any information it sees and recreate it and mix it up a little bit. Essentially, it's built to mimic. That's why he calls it the Mimic 1 program and eventually calls the creature the Mimic. The idea is that he's trying to make a playmate for his son that can learn things on the fly. And it does. It becomes incredibly close to his son and they hang out all the time. The Mimic acts like David and begins to copy his movements, and they get into a bunch of trouble together. But eventually, because Edwin's a bad father, David dies. Essentially, David runs out of the unlocked warehouse that they live in into traffic and gets hit by a car. And as if that wasn't bad enough, in his state of grief and still processing what happened, he eventually sees the Mimic pretending to act like David, holding David's favorite plushie and doing the things they used to do. In a fit of grief and rage, Edwin just starts mercilessly beating the machine into just a crumpled mess. Cut to sometime later, and Edwin has gone MIA. After not responding to their messages, Fazbear eventually sends a team to reclaim any projects he was working on so they can give it to another engineer. But when the team gets there, they find out they're not the first team that Fazbear sent. And in fact, the first team that Fazbear sent found the Mimic and repaired it, giving it legs, something that Edwin never did. Once it was able to walk around, the Mimic began brutally killing everyone as if it were doing chores. For instance, it would kill someone and hang them on a hanger, or break somebody's body as he shoves it into a fridge to put away food, stuff like that. However, with this new team, the Mimic just kills them in incredibly brutal ways and the story ends. So what does this story have to do with security breach in FNAF in general? Well, it has to do with ruin, because it's the Mimic. Now, is it the same Mimic? That's the big question, because the endoskeleton that gets described in this story does not look at all like the endoskeleton we see at the end of Ruin. The endoskeleton in this story is covered by a mass of wires that loop throughout the back of its head, out its eyes, down its neck, and there's a whole bunch of other specifics that we don't see in Ruin. That being said, the Mimic is able to repair itself with nearby robotic parts, so it's possible that if it is the same Mimic, then between when it was created and now, its appearance has drastically changed over repairing itself over and over again. But not only is the Mimic important from this story, but so is the Mimic 1 program used to create it, because many people believe the Mimic 1 program is the thing that gets inputted into Help Wanted to create Glitchtrap. Glitchtrap essentially being a manifestation of this program. And we see this idea doubled down in the Storyteller, Tiger Rock, and the Monty Within, so let's talk about those stories. The Storyteller is sort of a continuation of the Mimic, as it once again features Edwin Murray, but much later in his life. It also features Mr. Burrows, the chairman of the board of Fazbear. The important bits to know about this story is it follows the implementation of what's called the Storyteller, essentially a supercomputer AI that can create stories and actions for the animatronics to do, so they don't have to hire a creative writing team anymore. They just need to have somebody oversee the programs that this AI puts out, and the animatronics can act out whatever it comes up with. They then house this supercomputer inside a massive baobab tree that has its roots or wires go throughout the entire Pizzaplex. Stop using your right hand, Riley. There's a mic stand here. People, look, it looks like my hand disappears because of the mic. Riley, stop using your right hand. And it goes horribly, horribly wrong. It's one of the reasons I love this story that Scott is putting out there so publicly. Hey, AI cannot make art, it can only steal and make things worse. But on top of that, the AI that they're using is just the Mimic 1 program. Once it begins working in the Pizzaplex, all of the animatronics begin acting erratically. Their pre-programmed personalities are cranked up to an unsafe degree. For example, Monty is always brash and brutish and kind of aggressive, but after the Storyteller is implemented, he becomes violent and dangerous. Chica goes from a foodie who likes to snack into a glutton that can't stop eating. Perhaps my favorite, Glamrock Freddy, someone we don't get to see act this way in Security Breach, goes from the star of the show to a mega diva who tries to steal a toy out of a kid's hands and then throws a temper tantrum when it doesn't work. Eventually, as more and more things go wrong, Edwin Murray begins investigating the Storyteller to see what's up, only to find that a metal tiger head is placed in the center of the baobab tree, and inside that tiger's head is the Mimic 1 program. It's worth noting here that that tiger's head spawned horrible, violent memories and traumatic experiences in Edwin's mind. He basically has like a PTSD flashback, but it's never explained as to what caused that flashback. After all, we don't know what happens to Edwin after the Mimic, so whatever happened in between the story The Mimic and now has traumatically changed Edwin's life, and it has to do with this tiger head. But eventually, on one of the times Edwin Murray goes into the Storyteller to try to dismantle it, Mr. Burrows locks him inside to teach him a lesson, so he would eventually have to beg for his way out and get arrested. But after a few days of nothing happening, Mr. Burrows goes in to investigate and gets locked inside himself. He finds that Edwin Murray lost his mind and eventually suffocated in here, filling the area with drawings of weird symbols and shapes and writing "I'm sorry" over and over again, until eventually Mr. Burrows, realizing he's trapped too, will suffocate in a day or so. The story ends. This is actually a big point of contention for me. And truth be told, I've previously talked about the Storyteller and I think I was wrong. Previously, I thought this story was telling us how Glitchtrap was put into the games, that in the game timeline in Security Breach, a Storyteller-like thing was implemented. And that's what eventually becomes the Tangle, that big blob at the bottom of the basement. I thought that that big Freddy head we see on the way to FNAF 6 was the Storyteller, a massive Freddy head that could tell stories and program the other animatronics, and it was powered by the Molten Freddy head connected to wires. And that's how all the spirits come in and the programs, and I thought some massive sinkhole happened, it sunk into the bottom, and they paved over it. I think that's a worthwhile theory, but I've since changed my mind and I think that theory is wrong. And I also don't think it was just literally the Storyteller from the books, because of the special delivery emails. We know pretty much for a fact how Glitchtrap was put into the Pizzaplex system. The special delivery emails chronicle Vanessa isolating the Glitchtrap virus within Help Wanted, extracting that package, and then uploading it to the Pizzaplex directly and overriding security protocols. We literally, almost for a fact, know definitively that Vanessa essentially took Glitchtrap, put him on a USB, and plugged it into the Pizzaplex. There doesn't need to be a Storyteller here, so there probably wasn't a Storyteller. The method we get from Special Delivery, a game, an official game, directly goes against this narrative. In fact, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this is pretty definitive proof that the Tales from the Pizzaplex books cannot be in the game continuity, because the games nearly directly tell us how Vanessa uploads Glitchtrap to the Pizzaplex, and the books offer an alternative option. I know I'm definitely not the first person to think of this, so if there's a counter argument here, let me know. But I I can't think of one. So if that's not the reason why this story exists, what does this story tell us about the FNAF timeline? Well, the main thing, I think, is that this is an explanation for the actions and behaviors of the animatronics in Security Breach. By the time the game begins, the Glitchtrap program is within all of the animatronics except presumably Glamrock Freddy. So that's why all of their actions seem strange. Chica can't stop eating garbage, Roxanne Wolf is narcissistically obsessed with herself, and Monty is violent and aggressive. These are understandable personalities that have been cranked up. Think about it. Roxy was just a diva. Monty was just brash. Chica was just a foodie. But now that Glitchtrap has been inputted into their systems, their random quirks have been upped and turned into vices. So definitely put a pin there. And it's also worth noting that in this story, Chica is yellow and has a cupcake, which is definitively different than what we see Glamrock Chica looking like. In fact, it looks more like a classic Chica design. This could imply that originally the Pizzaplex animatronics were just the original 4, but that's a step too far, especially for this board. Regardless, it's worth noting. Next up is the Monty Within, and this is a deceptively important story, because the story itself is just a boy that plays a VR game with Monty in it, and then after the VR game keeps hearing Monty's voice and having the idea of Monty influence his actions. He has to actively fight back from the impulses that the Monty persona wants him to do. Until eventually, after fighting so much with Monty over and over again, Monty gets the better of him and forces this boy's head into a table saw, splitting his skull and killing him. Although, notably, it's very funny that the last thing this boy hears is Monty's voice saying rock and roll or something. So why do I think this is so important? I didn't click it before. This is the story of Jeremy from Help Wanted. Think about it. Someone plays a VR game, and a persona from that VR game enters their mind and tries to influence their actions and take control of them. But after fighting that entity with all of their will, the entity instead goes to kill the victim and move on to the next one. I can see this perfectly explaining what happens to Vanessa and what happens to Jeremy. Glitchtrap entered the mind of Vanessa through a VR machine, and instead of fighting back, she compartmentalizes Glitchtrap, forming the Vanny persona. But she is still now a follower of Glitchtrap and will do what he says when commanded. But Jeremy didn't. Jeremy fought against it tooth and nail, to the point where Glitchtrap gave up and thinking it's a lost cause and moved on to the next victim. But he had to make sure that Jeremy couldn't stop him. So he forces Jeremy to take the guillotine paper slicer and attack his own face, nearly killing him. But before Jeremy dies, he forces that body to go back into VR and put Glitchtrap back into the system. That is why when the tape girl goes back to work the next morning, she sees a faceless Jeremy wearing the VR headset. He's probably already dead, but Glitchtrap needed to get back into the system to infect another mind. But as confident as I am in that, that is heavy speculation. So for now, we'll put this note card summarizing the story and we'll move on. Tiger Rock is admittedly pretty quick to talk about because it's kind of just the Monty Within again. A boy enters a VR headset that's supposed to show what the Pizzaplex will look like 10 years from now, and he meets an animatronic called Tiger Rock and starts getting followed by him. Tiger Rock keeps holding onto his arms a bit too tight, but he gets away eventually. He thinks he leaves the VR machine and goes to live his normal life, but he keeps seeing Tiger Rock pop up in different locations. Well, not Tiger Rock specifically, but animals or objects that are meant to exist in the real world, but instead they're white animatronic versions with the same green and blue eyes that Tiger Rock has. And every time he sees one of those, he hurts his arm in some way, like he'll slam a window on it or fall down the stairs and land on them, until eventually he realizes he's still in the VR game and tries to escape. And he seemingly does get out this time, realizing that he's been trapped there the whole time. He goes home, he tries to go to bed, but Tiger Rock bursts through the window and rips off his arms, presumably killing him. I assume he never really left the VR machine. But once again, same as the Monty Within, it's some entity within a VR game hunting down and killing someone for being inside of it, and I guess not listening. If anything, if we're meant to put this on something specific, speculation, not going on the Lorkboard, I wonder if this is meant to explain Tape Girl from Help Wanted. We have the Monty Within for Jeremy, and we have Vanessa for Vanessa, but the Tape Girl goes unexplained. We don't really know what happens to her, just that her instructions get flipped on the last tape. I wonder if Tiger Rock is that explanation. She never got fully taken over, but because she was seen as a threat, she was killed anyway. So that's all the short stories dedicated to the Mimic and the Mimic 1 program, but what about the epilogues? Something I've thus far never brought up? Well, they also chronicle the Mimic, but it might not be the same one, or it's just been a long time and a lot of things have happened. Let's go into it. In the early stages of the Pizzaplex's construction, several construction workers are trying to clear out the FNAF 6 pizzeria underneath. The plans are to eventually turn this place into a museum of Fazbear, but there's a lot of random animatronics and endoskeletons scattered throughout the location. While they're clearing them out, they get a new shipment of animatronics, which is surprising because they shouldn't be getting any yet. But one of them is very notable, an endoskeleton that doesn't seem to match any of the other animatronics. It's described as being a bit bulkier and having a steel frame, and even though the head is shiny and new looking with metal rabbit ears, the rest of the body is burnt beyond discoloration. One of the construction workers examines it and finds a pretty sophisticated program within. He finds the Mimic 1 program, but trying to skirt out on some of his duties, he modifies it to give it a new command. Collect endoskeletons, take off the limbs and head, and put them in a pile. And it works. He calls himself a genius because the endoskeleton goes out and does the job that they've been tasked to do. But once the Mimic runs out of endoskeletons to do this to, it turns to the construction workers and continues to follow the orders, ripping off their limbs and putting their bodies in a pile. And then the story tries to make it out like some scary bad guy. The Mimic is just doing its job. It's just trying to slay, and these guys are in the way. But that's Epilogue 1. The other epilogues chronicle some teenagers that much later break into this FNAF 6 pizzeria and encounter the Mimic. However, we learn later in these epilogues that the Mimic isn't acting out of malice. We get a point of view from the Mimic in which it's exceedingly clear this robot is just following its orders. It's not seeking out to kill. In its point of view, it's going, there were 2 more bodies that I was told that I have to take the limbs off of, but they're not in this room. So I have to exit this room in the most efficient way possible so I can complete the task that was given to me. The task that is, remove limbs and heads from a body and put it on the pile. It just thinks humans are also animatronics. Notably, during this time, to lure one of the teenagers into a trap, it communicates over a radio pretending to be a small child. And some other notable features of this Mimic is that it always gives off some sort of EMP-like area of effect, where it neutralizes or messes with electronics nearby. By the end of the story, one of the teens is able to trick the Mimic into getting into a Springlock jester costume. Haha, a what? We'll get into it. But once it's inside, she's able to trigger the Springlocks, crumpling the Mimic and making it inoperable. She's then later able to escape. As far as important information from these epilogues, the camp that believe the Tales from the Pizzaplex stories are within continuity of the games see this as an explanation on how the Mimic ends up in the FNAF 6 pizzeria. But for me, several things don't line up. One, where is the Springlock jester suit it was trapped inside of? Granted, Vanny and GGY have presumably been down here and could have since removed it and repaired the Mimic. But when we see the Mimic in ruin, it seems as though it's trapped in that room while active because it's incredibly dangerous. So if it was disfigured and broken by a Springlock suit, this would mean that Vanny and GGY would have had to extract it from the suit, repair it, turn it on, and then trap it so they could have it functional, but not be killed by it. It seems odd. Not to mention that they physically don't line up at all. In the story, like I said, it's described as being very burnt, having a shiny new head with rabbit ears, and being like very complex and thick. But the Mimic we see in game is more of a bare endoskeleton with several different parts. And again, I understand the Mimic can repair itself with different pieces, so maybe that's what we're seeing here, but it's entirely different. Now sure, the epilogue description is closer to what we see with Burntrap, but that head description is so specific that I think it still warrants discussion. After all, there's also no visible flesh or anything attached to the Mimic in these stories, whereas Burntrap has flesh seemingly growing out of itself. If the Mimic from the epilogues is supposed to be either Burntrap or the Mimic from Ruin, there is a large gap of something happening that we don't know about here. However, even if these stories are not one-to-one with the games, they're incredibly important in learning more about what the Mimic we see in Ruin is capable of. For one, we learned that at some point Fazbear had an entire line of Mimic endoskeletons before discontinuing them because they began copying humans in unexpected ways. Furthermore, like I mentioned, this version of the Mimic seems to not be fueled by agony or violence that the one we saw in the story the Mimic is. The entire time it is literally just following the order it's given in Epilogue 1, with seemingly no malice. Meanwhile, in the story the Mimic, one of the dudes that came in to collect Fazbear stuff, it literally picks him up by like the scruff of his neck and his back and just logs his head into a wall. That's not following orders, nor is it doing a chore. It's just killing a dude. So what happened? Did it lose its agony, or is this something else? Is this a different mimic? Well, that's all speculation that we're going to have to figure out, but I think it is worth mentioning here. And that, plus maybe some cards that I forgot to mention, but I'm displaying them all right now, is all the references to the mimic that I think are relevant to the timeline from Tales from the Pizzaplex. All things considered, a lot of lore is added to these games from Tales from the Pizzaplex, even if they're not in the same continuity. So I understand why a lot of people believe them to be the same continuity. Like, just Tales from the Pizzaplex added twice the amount of lore that the Silver Eyes or Fazbear Frights was able to add. Man, this Lorkboard is getting crowded. All that's left to add is any miscellaneous books like the character encyclopedia, the cookbook or something, and then Security Breach and Ruin. And Help Wanted too. But for now, we'll call it there. If you missed part 1 of Tales from the Pizzaplex, I highly recommend checking it out right here. And if I missed anything about the mimic from the books, feel free to let me know. This is a group effort. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure to use hashtag #RyTart so I can find it. A huge shout out to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.